The day Perry Barker swore he would never kneel for any woman was the same day the town of Redrock Crossing buried his pride alongside the memory of a girl who had taken everything from him and left nothing but scorched earth. And that had been 7 years ago, long enough for a man to calcify his heart into something resembling stone. In the year 1878, the Arizona Territory was a place that did not forgive weakness, and Perry Barker had fashioned himself into something the territory could not break. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with pale gray eyes that people in saloons tended to look away from when he leveled them in their direction. His reputation was not built on cruelty exactly, but on a kind of cold precision that made men think twice before they reached for iron anywhere near him. He had ridden for cattle outfits, scouted for a land survey company, and done a few things along the way that he tried not to think too hard about in the dark hours before dawn. He was not a villain. He was not quite a hero either. He occupied that vast, dusty middle ground that most men in the territory called survival. Redrock Crossing itself was a town that existed because a river crossing existed, and because someone had decided to put a trading post beside it 30 years ago, and watch commerce slowly accrete around it like barnacles on a dock post. By 1878 it had 2 saloons, a general store, a smithy, a church that leaked when it rained, a doctor who drank more than he prescribed, and a sheriff named Walt Odom who was competent enough on his good days and merely adequate on the rest. The town sat in a shallow valley ringed by red rock formations that glowed orange in the mornings and turned the color of dried blood at dusk, and the people who lived there had long since stopped noticing how dramatic the scenery was because dramatic scenery, like most things in the territory, stopped being interesting once you were hungry enough. Perry had been riding through. That was the plan anyway. He had a letter from a cattle outfit in New Mexico Territory offering him seasonal work pushing a herd north to Colorado. And he had nothing in Redrock Crossing except a fondness for the cook at the Silver Bell Saloon who made a beef stew that was genuinely worth stopping for. He had been planning to eat 1 bowl of stew, sleep 1 night in the boarding house, and be back on the road to New Mexico by morning. He was at a table near the window of the Silver Bell, working through his 2nd bowl of that stew and pretending to ignore the card game happening 3 tables away, when the door opened and the afternoon light fell inside and Della Kingsley walked in. He did not kneel. He did not even stand. He just stopped chewing. She was 24 years old, though he would not learn that until later. She was wearing a dark blue riding coat that was visibly dusty from a long road, and she had a hat, a wide-brimmed brown felt hat with a cord of braided rawhide around the crown, pushed back on her head so that her dark hair showed in a wave across her forehead. She had brown eyes that caught the saloon light and held it for a moment before she swept the room with them in a quick, practical assessment that told Perry she had been in enough frontier saloons to know exactly how to look at one. Not afraid. Not entirely comfortable either, just clear-eyed about where she was. She walked to the bar and spoke to the barkeep, Ned Hurley, in a tone Perry could not quite hear over the noise of the card game. He watched Ned shake his head, watched her ask something else, watched Ned shake his head again, though with a slightly more apologetic expression this time. Perry went back to his stew. It was not his business. Except she turned from the bar and her eyes swept the room again and landed on him, and she walked toward him with the kind of directness that told him she had already figured out that he was, at this particular moment, the least threatening option in the establishment. "Excuse me," she said, stopping beside his table. Her voice was low and clear and slightly hoarse, the way voices got after a long day of trail dust. "The barkeep tells me you might know the roads east of here. I'm looking for the Ketterman Ranch." Perry set down his spoon. "Ketterman's gone," he said. "Old Chet Ketterman died last spring. His son sold the land to a mining outfit out of Tucson and moved to California." She absorbed this without any visible change in expression, which he found interesting. Most people, when told that the destination they had been riding toward for however many days did not exist anymore, allowed themselves at least a brief moment of dismay. She just looked at him steadily, recalibrating. "I see," she said. "I'm looking for work. I was told Ketterman ran a large operation and was looking for people with experience breaking and training horses." "He was," Perry said. "About 2 years ago that was true. Things change fast out here." "Yes," she said, and now the tiniest suggestion of weariness crossed her face, just a slight tightening around her eyes. "They do." Perry picked up his spoon again because it was not his business and the stew was getting cold, and then he put it back down again because apparently something in him had not yet received the message about minding his own affairs. "Try the Donahue spread," he said. "About 12 miles north. They run a remuda of 300 horses, and they've been short-handed since one of their men broke his leg in March. Tell them Perry Barker sent you." She looked at him with an expression that was evaluating without being unkind. "And are you well regarded by the Donahues, Perry Barker?" "Well enough that they won't run you off on principle," he said. "Whether they hire you depends on what you can do with a horse." "That," she said, and there was something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood, "won't be an issue." She thanked him, turned, and walked back toward the door, and Perry watched her go with the specific feeling of a man who has just handed off a responsibility he did not ask for and finds, to his mild irritation, that he is not quite as relieved as he expected. He finished his stew. He paid for his room. He went asleep thinking about New Mexico. He woke up thinking about her expression when she learned that Ketterman's was gone, not the weariness, but the steadiness underneath it. He rode north in the morning instead of east. He told himself it was because the Donahue spread was on the way, more or less, and it would be simple enough to stop in and say hello to old Marcus Donahue and mention he had sent someone their way. This was a reasonable and entirely practical explanation that had almost nothing to do with the woman in the blue coat, and Perry was a man who was capable of telling himself reasonable and practical lies with considerable conviction. The Donahue spread announced itself from half a mile out with the smell of horses and fresh-worked leather, a smell Perry had always found more honestly comforting than anything he had encountered in any town. The main house was a solid adobe structure with a wide porch, and the corrals spread out behind it in an organized sequence. The breaking pen, the training yard, the holding pasture that spoke to years of practical thought about how to work horses without wasting motion. He found Marcus Donahue standing at the fence of the breaking pen, one boot on the lower rail, watching what was happening inside with an expression of absorbed attention. What was happening inside was Della Kingsley, on the back of a blue roan gelding that had clearly not yet decided to accept the situation, and she was riding him. Not fighting him, riding him. There was a distinction, Perry understood immediately, and it was the difference between someone who had learned horse breaking as a technique and someone who had learned it as a language. The roan was testing her short, sharp bucks, a sideways lunge toward the fence, a spinning half-rear, and she was not countering him so much as she was answering him, shifting her weight in small, precise adjustments that told the horse, over and over again without force, that she was not a threat and she was not leaving either. Marcus Donahue did not look away from the pen when Perry came to stand beside him. "Friend of yours," he said. "Never met her before yesterday," Perry said. "She rode in this morning and asked for work," Marcus said. "I told her I'd watch her with one horse before I made up my mind. That was 40 minutes ago and she's already got him settling." He shook his head slowly. "Girl's got a gift. Are you going to hire her?" "Already did," Marcus said. "The minute she put her second foot in the stirrup and he didn't throw her." Inside the pen, the roan had stopped bucking. He was still tense, his ears swiveling in tight arcs, but his stride had changed from explosive to something almost rhythmic, and Della was sitting quiet on him, one hand low, the other resting easy on her thigh, letting him work through the last of his nerves on his own terms. She had not noticed Perry yet. He was glad of it, because it meant he could watch her without whatever expression he was wearing being observed, and he had the feeling that his expression was not entirely consistent with the story he had been telling himself about merely stopping in to check on a practical errand. She brought the roan to a walk, then a halt, then stepped down smooth and quiet, running a hand along the horse's neck in a gesture that was not performative but simply honest acknowledgement, not reward. She turned and saw Perry at the fence, and something passed across her face that he could not categorize: surprise, perhaps, or something more complicated than surprise. "You came," she said. "Passing through," he said. "Of course," she said, and there was that almost smile again. Marcus Donohue, who was not a man without perception, looked from one of them to the other and said nothing at all. Perry stayed 3 days. He told himself and Marcus and anyone else who asked that he was resting his horse before the ride east. His horse, a deep-chested bay named Solomon, was in no need of rest and had the energy to prove it. But Solomon was not the sort of animal to contradict his rider out loud, which Perry considered one of his finer qualities. On the first day, Perry helped repair a section of fence that had been pulled down when a spooked horse ran through it, and Della worked at the far end of the training yard, and they did not speak except at supper when Marcus's wife, a compact and forthright woman named Bet, seated them across from each other and made conversation inevitable. "Where are you from, Miss Kingsley?" Bet asked. "Texas," Della said. "East Texas originally, near Marshall." "Long way from home," Marcus observed. "My family's ranch was sold 3 years ago when my father died," Della said, with the particular calm of someone who has told a difficult truth so many times it has worn smooth. "My mother went to live with her sister in Louisiana. I had no interest in Louisiana." She paused. "I had some money and a horse and a set of skills, and I decided to go where the work was." "Alone?" Bet asked, not unkindly but directly. "There were other options," Della said. "None of them interested me either." Perry, who was concentrating very hard on his plate, felt her eyes move to him briefly and then away. "Perry," Bet said, because she was the kind of woman who did not leave conversational opportunities lying on the table. "How long since you've been back to wherever you're from?" "I'm not from anywhere in particular," Perry said. "Everyone's from somewhere," Bet said. "Wichita originally," he said. "Before that, a farm in Missouri that I left when I was 16 and have not returned to." "Family there?" Bet asked. "A brother," Perry said. "We don't correspond regularly." Said Bet, in a tone that contained an entire paragraph of editorial content. On the second day, Perry was oiling his saddle on the porch when Della came and sat on the porch steps with a length of bridle she was restitching, and they were quiet together for a while in a way that was not uncomfortable, which Perry found more unsettling than discomfort would have been. "Why did you tell me about the Donohues?" she asked eventually, without looking up from her stitching. "It was useful information," he said. "You could have kept eating your stew." "I could have," he agreed. She looked up at him then, and there was something direct and unguarded in her eyes that he was not entirely prepared for. "Are you always helpful to strangers who wander into your line of sight?" "No," he said honestly. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her stitching. "I didn't think so," she said, and something in her voice was quieter than the words themselves. They worked in silence for a little while after that, and Perry was aware of her in the way he was aware of certain kinds of weather, the particular quality of stillness before a thunderstorm, or the change in air pressure that meant something significant was coming whether you had prepared for it or not. On the third day, Marcus needed a horse delivered to a rancher named Cal Webb, whose spread was about 8 miles west across a stretch of broken country that ran along the base of the Red Rock formations. He mentioned at breakfast that he was going to send one of his hands to do it after the morning work was done. "I'll take it," Perry said. Marcus raised his eyebrows but said nothing. "I'll go too," Della said. "I've been meaning to look at the country west of here, for reference." Bet Donohue set down her coffee cup and appeared to find something extremely interesting about the grain of the table. They rode out together at mid-morning, Perry on Solomon and Della on a solid Appaloosa mare named Cress that Marcus had loaned her, leading the delivery horse, a gray quarter horse with a white blaze on a rope behind them. The country west of the Donahue spread was rougher than the road, full of arroyos and loose shale slopes and stretches of mesquite that grabbed at your legs if you weren't careful. But the red rock formations above it were extraordinary in the morning light, rising from the valley floor in columns and arches that looked like the ruins of something impossibly large. "I've been all the way from East Texas to this territory," Della said, riding beside him through a gap in the rock, "and I have never seen anything like this. Most people who see it either stay forever or leave as fast as they can," Perry said. "Which are you?" "I haven't decided yet," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That seems like an uncomfortable way to live. What's the alternative?" "Deciding," she said simply. He thought about that for a while as they rode, the horses picking their way carefully over the shale. The sun was getting high and the heat was beginning to build in the way that it did in the territory, not gradually but in layers, each one more serious than the last. "What would you decide," he asked, "if you were me?" "I'm not you," she said, "but if I were." She looked at the rocks above them, at the red and amber and ochre of the formations in the noon light. "I think I'd decide to stay, at least long enough to see what this place looked like in every season." They delivered the horse to Cal Webb, a weathered man in his 60s who gave them water and cornbread and tried to pay Perry $2 for the trouble, which Perry refused, and Della accepted on the grounds that it was an honest transaction, and Cal had offered it honestly, which made Cal laugh and call her sensible and make Perry feel that he had been, somehow, shown up in a small and entirely fair way. On the ride back, a summer storm came down off the rocks fast and without much warning, the way territory storms did, and they sheltered in the lee of a rock formation while the rain came in sideways, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 10 minutes, and lightning walked across the ridge above them like something with purpose. They stood close together under the overhang, not quite touching, the horses pressed behind them and the rain roaring on the rock face above, and Della was laughing. Not nervous laughter. Genuine laughter, full-throated and unguarded at the sheer dramatic excess of the storm, at the horses' expressions of offended dignity, at the way Perry's hat was dripping in a steady stream off its brim. He looked at her laughing and felt something crack open in his chest that he had spent 7 years carefully sealing shut, and it was not a comfortable feeling, but it was unmistakably real. "What's funny?" he said, though he was smiling himself and could not account for it. "All of it," she said, gesturing at the storm, the rocks, the two of them pressed under this overhang with their horses in the middle of a territory neither of them had planned to stay in. "All of it is funny." He stood in the rain sound and looked at her and thought, "I am in very serious trouble." He still rode out the next morning. He had a contract to fulfill in New Mexico, and he was a man who honored his commitments, and he also needed, with some urgency, to put some distance between himself and whatever was happening to him so that he could think about it clearly. He had been on the road for about 40 minutes when he reined Solomon in at the top of a low rise and sat there looking at the country ahead of him, flat and brown and unremarkable, leading to New Mexico, leading to the job, leading to the rest of the plan that had seemed so clear and straightforward before he walked into the Silver Bell Saloon. He turned Solomon around. He told himself it was because he had left his knife-sharpening stone in the bunkhouse at Donahue's, which was true. He told himself that was the only reason. He told himself this with somewhat less conviction than usual. He did not find Della when he got back. He found Marcus instead, who looked at him with the particular expression of a man who had seen this kind of thing before and declined to comment on it out of mercy. "She rode up into the formation country," Marcus said. "Said she wanted to see the view from the top of the big arch. Been gone about an hour." "The arch on the north side," Perry said. "That's the one." Perry tied Solomon to the post and went after her on foot because the trail to the arch was not horse country. It went up a series of natural rock steps, worn smooth by years of water, and switchbacked up the face of the formation through a narrow passage that was cool even in the afternoon heat and smelled of stone and something faintly mineral. He found her at the top, standing on the arch itself, a span of red rock 50 feet wide and 10 feet thick that curved over a 200-foot drop to the canyon below, with her arms slightly out from her sides for balance, and her face turned to the north where the territory spread out in its full, terrifying beauty. The wind at that height came in long, steady surges, and her hair was loose from its pinning and moving in it, and her hat, that brown felt hat with the braided rawhide cord, caught a particularly strong gust and lifted cleanly from her head. Perry was already moving. He had come up through the passage and was about 10 feet behind her when the hat went, and he lunged forward and caught it a foot from the edge, and the momentum of the lunge and the uneven rock surface of the arch combined to put him on his knees, one hand braced on the rock, the other holding the hat up like he had caught something valuable, which he had. He was kneeling when she turned. She looked at him on his knees on the arch with her hat in his hand and the canyon dropping away behind him, and her expression was something he could not parse, surprised and soft, and something deeper than either. Perry Barker, who had sworn 7 years ago that he would never kneel for any woman, was already on the ground before he knew he was moving. He looked up at her from the rock, hat in hand, and the thing in his chest that had cracked open 2 days ago in the rain sound under the overhang cracked the rest of the way. "Your hat," he said, because he was not yet capable of anything more coherent. She took it from him slowly, her fingers brushing his, and she did not put it back on. She held it against her chest and looked at him with those brown eyes that held the territory light, and she said, "Thank you, Perry Barker." He got to his feet. They were close now, closer than was practical given the narrow width of the arch and the drop on either side, and he was looking at her with the specific helplessness of a man who has reached the end of all his excellent reasons for keeping his distance. "I came back for my knife stone," he said. "Did you?" she said. "It's a very good stone." "I'm sure it is," she said, and there was a softness in her voice that was completely different from pity, which he had always hated, and completely different from amusement, which was closer but still not right. It was warmth, he realized. Simple, uncomplicated warmth. He could not remember the last time someone had looked at him with simple warmth. "I should have kept going," he said, "to New Mexico. Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a long moment, at the territory spreading out behind her, at the afternoon light on the red rocks, at the hat she was holding against her chest with both hands. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, which was honest. "You don't have to explain it," she said, which was generous. They stood on the arch in the wind, and the silence that was not quite silence but was full of wind sound and distant hawk cry, and the general vast hum of a land that was old enough not to need to justify itself to anyone. And Perry thought that he had been to more places than most men his age, and had not expected to find himself standing over a canyon in the Arizona territory, having been brought to his knees by a woman's hat, feeling more certain about something than he had felt in 7 years. He did not kiss her that day on the arch. He was not that kind of man, the kind who moved fast in moments of heightened feeling and regretted it later. He was the kind of man who knew the difference between a feeling and a decision, even when the feeling was very loud. But he offered her his arm when they started back across the arch, and she took it, and they came down from the formation together in the late afternoon light, and Perry told Marcus Donahue that he had reconsidered the New Mexico contract and would be staying in Red Rock Crossing for a while if Marcus had work. Marcus said he did. Bet set an extra place at supper without being asked. The weeks that followed were among the most useful and quietly confusing of Perry's life. He worked for Marcus Donahue doing the 100 things that a working horse ranch required: fence repair, saddle maintenance, driving stock to market, scouting water sources in the dry season. And in the mornings and evenings, he watched Della work horses in the training yard and found that it never became ordinary, the way she did it. She had a particular method for working with animals that had been mistreated horses that had been broken the hard way, with force and fear, that required patience of a kind Perry found humbling. She would spend days just standing in a corral with a frightened horse, not asking anything of it, just being present until the animal began to understand that her presence was not a precursor to pain. It was slow, and it was not dramatic, and it worked. And watching it gave Perry a feeling he eventually identified as recognition. Something in her approach reminded him of what he had been trying to do for himself for 7 years, without the same success. They talked in the evenings, on the porch or walking the perimeter of the property as the light failed, and Perry learned her in the gradual way that good things are learned, not all at once, but in layers, each one revealing something that made the previous ones more interesting rather than less. Her father had been a man named James Kingsley, who ran horses in East Texas with a commitment to his animals, and his land that Della described with a love that was all the more evident for how matter-of-factly she spoke it. He had died of a fever in the summer of 1875, quickly and without warning, and the ranch, which had been mortgaged against a bad year, had been claimed by the bank within 6 months. Her mother had survived it, had gone to her sister in Louisiana, and Della had not gone with her, not because she did not love her mother, but because she could not be in a house in Louisiana where there was nothing useful to do and nowhere for a horse to run. "I could have married," she said one evening, not defensively but simply stating a fact. "There were men who asked, some of them were decent men. 'Why didn't you?' Perry asked. "Because I would have been marrying a solution to a problem," she said, "and that seems like a poor beginning for something that has to last 40 years. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think a good beginning looks like?" She considered this seriously. "I think it looks like 2 people who would choose each other even if there were no problem to solve," she said. "People who are choosing each other because the other person is genuinely worth choosing." Perry thought about this for a long time after she said it. He thought about Eleanor Marsh, who had been 21 when he was 21, and who had been beautiful and reckless, and had chosen him, and then unchosen him over the course of 3 months, in a way that had involved another man and a great deal of public humiliation, and had left Perry with the conviction that choosing was a trap, that the openness required for genuine choosing was only a gap in your defenses, and defenses existed for reasons. He had been carrying this conviction for 7 years, and it had done its job faithfully. It had kept him from being made a fool of again. It had also kept him from most of the things that made a life worth the trouble of living it, a cost he had been willing to pay in the abstract, but which was becoming, in the specific presence of Della Kingsley, increasingly difficult to justify. There was a night in late July when a storm came through again. Not the playful afternoon kind, but a serious night storm with thunder that shook the adobe and lightning that turned the valley white every few seconds. And Perry was in the bunkhouse, unable to sleep, and heard, above the storm, a sound from the horse barn that was wrong. He was out the bunkhouse door and across the yard in the rain before he had quite thought about it, and he found 3 of the horses in a state of genuine terror. A bay mare had gotten her lead rope tangled and was pulling back so hard she was about to injure herself, and 2 others were circling their stalls in tight, panicked ovals. He also found Della already there, barefoot, in a long work shirt, her hair down around her shoulders, moving through the barn with a lantern and a voice that was doing the same thing in the dark, and the thunder that he had watched her do in the training yard in daylight, calm, low, present, not demanding anything, just making her presence into something the horses could find and hold onto. He moved to the mare with the tangled rope and got it free, and the mare pressed her head against his chest in the particular way of frightened horses who have found something solid, and he held her and felt the thunder go through the barn walls and watched Della move from stall to stall in the lantern light, her bare feet on the straw, her voice underneath the storm. When the worst of it had passed and the horses were settling, she came and stood beside him, and they were both wet and neither of them said anything for a minute because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. "You didn't have to come out," she said finally. "Neither did you," he said. She looked up at him in the lantern light, rain still dripping from her hair, and Perry Barker, who had been constructing his retreat from this moment for weeks, found that he had no retreat left. He had spent it all somewhere in the previous weeks, in 100 small transactions of honesty and proximity, and he had nothing left to retreat behind. He reached up and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, very slowly, giving her all the time in the world to move away from his hand. She did not move away. "Della," he said, and her name and his voice surprised him with how much he had been saying it silently for weeks. "Perry," she said, and the way she said it was an answer to a question he had not quite finished asking. He kissed her in the horse barn in the dying storm, with his hands on either side of her face and the lantern swinging on its hook and the horses quiet around them. And she kissed him back with a certainty that undid every careful wall he had built and did not apologize for the undoing. He pulled back after a moment and looked at her, needing to see her face clearly, needing to know that what he was seeing was real and not a thing his long, hungry heart was manufacturing. Her eyes were open. She was looking at him with that direct, unguarded steadiness that he had noticed the first night in the Silver Bell and that he understood now was not a performance but was simply who she was, a woman who had looked at hard things directly for long enough that she had lost the habit of looking away. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I've been avoiding this," he said. "Not you specifically, this, the whatever this is." "I know," she said. "I'm not good at it," he said. "I was once, or I thought I was, and then I was wrong about it in a way that I didn't recover from well, and I've been." He stopped because he was not used to saying these things and the words felt awkward in his mouth. "I've been cautious." "You've been scared," she said, not unkindly but precisely. He almost argued it. He swallowed the argument. "Yes," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I'm scared too. I'm 24 years old and I've been on my own for 3 years and I have gotten very good at not needing anyone, and I am aware that being good at not needing anyone is not the same as being happy." She paused. "I'm also aware that you kneeled on an arch 50 feet over a canyon to catch my hat, and I have been thinking about that almost constantly since it happened." He laughed. It came out of him startled and real, the way laughing did when it was genuine rather than social, and her face opened into a full smile that he had not yet seen at its full extent, and that was, he thought, extraordinary. "I caught the hat," he said. "You did," she agreed. "That was about the hat." "Perry," she said, and she was still smiling. "Nothing about that was about the hat." He looked at her. He looked at this woman who had walked into a saloon in Redrock, crossing with dust on her coat and clear eyes, and a destination that had ceased to exist, who had ridden a terror-stricken roan into submission through patience rather than force, who had laughed on an arch over a canyon in a lightning storm, who was standing barefoot in a horse barn in the rain telling him truths about himself with the gentleness of someone who understood that truth did not require a cutting edge to go deep. "I don't have much to offer," he said. "I have a horse and a saddle and a reputation that's more complicated than useful, and no land and no—" "Perry," she said, "I'm trying to be honest with you." "I know you are," she said. "I'm not asking you for land." "What are you asking for?" She looked at him steadily. "The same thing I imagine you are," she said. "Someone worth choosing." He pulled her back toward him and she came without hesitation, and the storm outside was finishing itself against the rocks above the valley, and the horses were quiet in their stalls, and Perry Barker, the gunslinger who had sworn he would never kneel for any woman, held Della Kingsley in a horse barn in the Arizona territory, and understood, with the clarity of something finally and irrevocably decided, that he was done running. The weeks after that had a different quality to them, warmer and more complicated and richer in the way that things become rich when they matter. They were circumspect in front of Marcus and Bet, not from shame but from respect, because Marcus and Bet had given them both a place to land, and neither of them wanted to create awkwardness in someone else's household. But Marcus and Bet were not deceived, and did not pretend to be, and Bet in particular had the look of someone whose theory of events had been confirmed, and who was taking quiet satisfaction in it. The complications arrived, as complications tended to in the territory, in the form of a man named Cutter Hoyle. Hoyle was a landman, which in 1878 meant a person employed by various interests, some legitimate and some less so, to acquire land in the territory through methods that ranged from straightforward purchase to various forms of pressure that stopped just short of what the law would address directly. He worked for the Tucson mining outfit that had bought Ketterman's spread, and his interest in the Donahue property was something Marcus had been aware of for months. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday in early August, a thick man in an expensive suit that was wrong for the climate, with two men behind him who wore guns in a way that was designed to communicate a point without technically making a threat. Perry was at the fence of the training yard when Hoyle rode in, and he stayed where he was, watching, his back to the fence and his arms loose. Marcus came out onto the porch and spoke with Hoyle for 20 minutes. Perry could not hear the conversation from where he was, but he could read Marcus's posture steady and flat, and not intimidated, the posture of a man who knew what he owned and was not confused about it. When Hoyle rode out, he passed the training yard and looked at Perry with the particular assessment of a man who catalogs potential obstacles, and Perry looked back at him with the particular flatness of a man who has been catalogued by worse. Marcus came and leaned on the fence beside Perry. "He wants the property," Marcus said. "He's been at it since spring. The mining outfit wants the water rights. There's a stream that runs through the south pasture that they need for their operation east of here." "What did you tell him?" "What I've been telling him," Marcus said, "that it's not for sale. He'll come back," Perry said. "He always does," Marcus said. "So far he's been legal about it." "Annoying but legal," Perry nodded. "Let me know if that changes," he said. Marcus looked at him sideways. "I appreciate the offer. I also want to be clear. I'm not asking you to fight my battles, Perry. I have a sheriff I can call on and I know how to file papers." "I know that," Perry said. "I'm not offering to fight anyone. I'm offering to be present. There's a difference." Marcus considered this and accepted it. The trouble escalated slowly, the way trouble did in the territory when money was involved, not with a single dramatic event, but with accumulation. A section of fence went down on the south pasture in circumstances that were not quite explainable by natural causes. One of Marcus's hands was approached in town by one of Hoyle's men and offered money to leave his employment. Two horses spooked in the north pasture one night in a way that suggested someone had deliberately frightened them. None of it was enough to bring to Walt Odom, who was sheriff but was also a man who needed more than implication before he would act. Marcus kept records and kept his temper and kept refusing Hoyle's increasingly pointed offers, and Perry stayed and kept his eyes open. Della was not unaware of what was happening. She never was. She came to Perry one evening in early September while he was cleaning his gun on the porch, a routine maintenance, not drama, and sat beside him without asking permission. "Marcus told me what Hoyle's been doing," she said. "I figured he would. Are you going to do something about it?" "I'm going to be here," Perry said, "which is different from doing something about it." "Is it?" He looked at her. "I'm trying not to be the man who solves problems with a gun," he said. "I've been that man. It doesn't resolve things cleanly. What do you resolve things with instead?" "Presence," he said. "Patience. The knowledge that most men who operate the way Hoyle operates have a threshold, and when they realize the cost of continuing is higher than the return, they move on." Della was quiet for a moment. "And if they don't, then we use the law," Perry said. "And if the law isn't sufficient, we use what's available, in that order." She looked at the gun in his hands and then at his face. "You're a careful man," she said, and it was not criticism, it was observation. "I've had to be," he said. She reached over and put her hand over his, the gun between them, and looked at him steadily. "I trust your judgment," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not asking you to be other than you are." He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat on the porch in the September evening while the territory cooled around them, and Perry felt that particular quality of being known, and accepted that he had not experienced in so long he had almost stopped believing it existed. Hoyle came back in mid-September with a different approach. He came without his men this time, alone, and he asked to speak to Perry rather than Marcus. Perry received this information from Marcus with a neutral expression and walked out to meet him in the yard. Hoyle was direct. He said the mining outfit was willing to pay Perry a consulting fee to encourage Marcus Donahue to consider the sale. He quoted a number that was reasonable and a larger number that was not reasonable, and that was meant to communicate the seriousness of the interest. Perry listened to all of it without expression. "My answer is no," he said, "and I want to be clear about something. I'm not going to change my answer, and I'm not going to discuss it further. If you want to continue making offers to Marcus Donahue, that's between you and him. If you want to continue interfering with his property, the fences, the horses, you should know that I've been making notes, and so has Marcus, and Sheriff Odom has a file that is getting close to the threshold for action. I'd advise you to look at what you're doing and decide if the water rights on this particular piece of ground are worth the trouble." Hoyle studied him for a long moment. "You're awfully protective of someone else's property," he said. "Yes," Perry said simply. "You planning to stay here long?" "That's not something I'm going to discuss with you," Perry said. Hoyle left. He did not come back. There was one more incident. A gate left open in the north pasture that let 6 horses drift out into the range. But Marcus recovered the horses, and the incident stopped after that, as if the disruptions were a test, and the lack of response to them had established that the test was not working. Walt Odom rode out in October to mention that Hoyle had filed papers with the land office in Tucson, arguing that Marcus's water rights documentation had a technical deficiency, which was the kind of legal maneuvering that was slow and expensive and annoying, but was also, in the end, the legitimate process rather than intimidation, and Marcus had a lawyer in Prescott who addressed it. The whole business resolved itself by late fall, not with drama, but with Hoyle simply moving his attention to another property, as Perry had predicted he would. Marcus never quite said thank you in direct words, but he raised Perry's wages in November and told him there was a place at Donahue's as long as Perry wanted it, which Perry understood was the equivalent. It was in November, during the first cold snap of the season, that Perry asked Marcus Donahue for a private conversation. Marcus took him into his study, a small room with a desk covered in ledgers and a single window facing the training yard, where Della was working a young buckskin through its early paces in the pale November light. "I want to marry Della," Perry said. He had not planned a preamble and did not attempt one. Marcus looked at him and then looked out the window at Della in the training yard and then looked back at Perry. "Does she know that?" "I intend to ask her," Perry said, "but I wanted to speak to you first. She's been under your roof and your employ, and you and Bet have been as close to family as she is out here. I wanted to be respectful of that." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Della Kingsley," he said, "is a grown woman who has made her own decisions for 3 years and done it competently. She doesn't need my permission." "I know that," Perry said. "I'm asking for your blessing. There's a difference." Marcus looked at him for a long time, and whatever he was looking for, he apparently found it, because he said, "You're a good man, Perry. Better than you think you are, which is generally the case with men worth anything." He paused. "You have my blessing. You have Bet's too, for what it's worth, and hers will probably mean more to Della in the long run." Perry asked Della that evening, not with great ceremony but with the honesty he had learned over these months was the only currency she trusted. He found her on the porch after supper, the cold, clear sky above the valley enormous and starlit in the way that the territory sky was enormous and starlit in November, and he sat beside her and said what he meant. "I'm not the same man I was when I rode into town in August," he said. "I'm not sure I would have said that 6 months ago about anything, but it's true. Being here, being near you, I've had to look at things about myself that I had gotten good at not looking at, and it's been uncomfortable, but I think it's also been necessary, and I think you're the reason." She was looking at the sky. "I know I said I didn't have much to offer," he said. "I still don't have land. I have wages and savings and skills and a good horse, and I have the intention to do better with what I have than I've done in the past. but mostly what I have to offer is that I see you, Della. I see you clearly, and everything I see is worth choosing." She turned to look at him, and her eyes in the starlight were dark and soft and very steady. "I want to be your wife," she said. "I have wanted it since you got up off your knees on that arch with my hat in your hand and looked at me like you just figured out something important." "I had," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell." He took her hand and held it. The cold air around them and the stars above the valley and the sound of the horses in the barn. And Perry Barker, who had sworn never to kneel for any woman, thought that being brought to his knees had turned out to be the most useful thing that had ever happened to him. They were married in December, in the church that leaked when it rained, but December was dry and the leak did not present itself, and the ceremony was conducted by a Methodist minister named Abernathy, who was visiting Redrock crossing from Prescott, and who turned out to have a fine speaking voice and a genuine pleasure in the proceedings. Marcus gave Della away with a solemnity that was clearly costing him some effort to maintain, and that dissolved entirely when Bet, seated in the front row, produced a handkerchief. Walt Odom attended in his official capacity as the town's primary representative of law and order, and a good portion of Redrock Crossing turned out because weddings in the territory in December were among the more festive events available, and no one wanted to miss one. Perry stood at the front of the church and watched Della come down the aisle in a dress that Bet had helped her make over the previous weeks, dark green wool, clean and simple, with a small string of amber beads at her throat that had been her mother's. And he felt what he recognized now, having had months to learn the shape of it, as the specific feeling of being in the right place at the right time for the first time in his adult life. She came to stand beside him and looked up at him with those clear brown eyes, and he thought, 7 years. 7 years of running, and he had needed to walk into a saloon in Redrock Crossing and eat a bowl of stew and look up at the right moment. "You're smiling," she said quietly, while Abernathy found his place in the ceremony. "I'm allowed," he said. "You are," she agreed, and she was smiling too. The ceremony was brief and genuine. When Abernathy asked if Perry Barker took this woman, Perry said, "I do," in a voice that was entirely clear and entirely decided, the voice of a man who had made up his mind and was not confused about it. When Abernathy asked if Della Kingsley took this man, she looked at Perry for a moment before she answered, not hesitating but choosing deliberately, fully, with her whole attention, and said, "I do," in a way that made at least 3 people in the first 2 rows produce handkerchiefs, including Walt Odom, who later claimed it was dust from the road. They had a small celebration at the Silver Bell, the same saloon where they had met, which pleased Della and which Perry found appropriate in a way he could not quite articulate, and the cook produced a supper of beef and beans and cornbread that was not elegant but was generous and warm, and Marcus made a toast that began as formal and became, somewhere in the middle, entirely genuine. "I have known a good many people in my years in this territory," Marcus said, his glass raised, "and I have found that the ones worth knowing are the ones who show up when they're needed and stay when things get difficult, and tell the truth even when it's complicated. These 2 people are both of that kind, and they deserve everything that comes from being of that kind, which is to say they deserve each other and everything that follows." "That was beautiful," Bet said, and wiped her eyes again, and Marcus sat down looking satisfied. They stayed that night at the boarding house in Redrock Crossing. Perry had arranged a room, and in the morning they came back to the Donahue spread, because Perry had the work and Della had her horses, and there was no reason to go anywhere else, not yet. The winter settled around them. The days were short and cold and full of work, and the evenings were warm with fire and conversation, and the particular quality of a new marriage between 2 people who had each been alone long enough to understand what they had and not take it for granted. Perry wrote a letter to his brother Daniel in Missouri, the first in 4 years. He told Daniel He had gotten married and was working horses in the Arizona territory, and that he was, for reasons he was still in the process of understanding, genuinely content. Daniel wrote back 3 months later expressing surprise and pleasure in equal measure, and mentioning that he had married himself 2 years prior and had a son, and that the farm in Missouri was doing well enough. It was a longer letter than any they had exchanged in years, and Perry read it twice and showed it to Della, who wrote a letter to Daniel's wife, whose name was Clara, and began a correspondence that would last decades. Della wrote to her mother in Louisiana as well, a longer and more complicated letter, and her mother's response arrived in February and was warm and full of tears, and also full of questions about Perry that Della answered in her next letter with a thoroughness that Perry found both touching and slightly overwhelming. In the spring of 1879, Della became pregnant. She knew it before she told Perry, taking the time to be sure, and when she told him, she watched his face move through several things in quick succession: shock, then something deep and still, then a smile that was different from any she had seen on him before, wider and less guarded, a smile that had no protection in it at all. He pulled her to him and held her for a long time without saying anything, and when he spoke his voice was thicker than usual. "I didn't think I wanted this," he said, which was honest. "I thought I had decided not to want it. And now," she said into his shoulder, "and now I can't imagine anything I've ever wanted more," he said, which was equally honest. Della's mother came from Louisiana in the summer of that year, arriving in Rock Crossing on the stage in late June, a small, upright woman named Kingsley who had her daughter's eyes and a composure that had clearly been tested and had held. Perry met her at the stage stop and took her bag, and she looked at him for a long, level moment that he understood was the same kind of assessment her daughter had given him in the Silver Bell a year earlier. "My daughter tells me you are a good man," Catherine said. "I'm trying to be," Perry said. "That's more honest than claiming to already be one," she said, and her expression indicated this was a point in his favor. Catherine stayed through the summer and was present for the birth in August, and the birth was hard the way births were hard in the territory, where the nearest doctor was in town, and the nearest hospital was somewhere theoretical. But Bet Donahue had helped with births before, and the doctor in Rock Crossing, who was sober when it counted, made the ride out, and the night was long and frightening in the way that long nights are frightening when you care about what happens. Perry sat on the porch in the dark and watched the stars and had, for the first time in a decade, a conversation with God that was not argumentative. He did not ask for what he wanted exactly. He asked, as clearly and honestly as he could manage, for whatever was right, and he sat with that uncertainty and did not run from it, which felt like the most important thing he had done. The boy was born at 4 in the morning and was large and loud and appeared to have opinions about the world from the first moment he entered it, which Perry found immediately and unreasonably hilarious. He was allowed in when the room was settled, and he came to the bed where Della lay exhausted and bright-eyed and held the child that Bet put in his arms, this solid, objecting, spectacular fact, and looked at Della over the child's head. "He's very angry about something," Perry said. "He'll settle," Della said. Her voice was exhausted and fond. "He has your stubbornness already," Perry said. "He has yours," she said. "Look at the set of his jaw." Perry looked at the set of his jaw and felt something so large he had no word for it, only the fact of it filling his chest and his arms and the whole of that pre-dawn room. "What do we name him?" Della asked. They had discussed names over the previous months without arriving at a final answer, both of them reluctant to decide in advance on something so important. Perry looked at the boy and thought about the things he wanted for him, not ambition, not safety exactly, but something that the father of a child born in the Arizona territory in 1879 could want that was honest and real. "James," Perry said, "for your father." Della's eyes filled. She reached up and touched Perry's face, and he bent down and kissed her forehead. And Kingsley, who had been standing in the doorway, made a quiet sound that she converted quickly into leaving the room, which was the kindest thing she could have done. Catherine stayed another 2 weeks and then returned to Louisiana, but she and Della had repaired something between them in those summer weeks, some of the accumulated distance of 3 years of separation and silence, and the letters between them afterward were more frequent and more open. James Barker grew. He grew fast and loud and interested in everything, as babies do in families where attention is freely given. And by the time he could walk, he was following Perry around the property with the determined toddling of a small person who intends to learn everything there is to know about horses, fences, and the general operation of a working ranch. Della went back to work with the horses not long after James was old enough to be safely minded for portions of the day, which Bet did cheerfully, and which Marcus considered a reasonable arrangement on the grounds that a woman with Della's gift for horses was wasted on domestic idleness. Perry agreed entirely and said so, and Della looked at him with the expression he had come to understand, meant she was pleased about something but had not yet decided whether to show it. In the spring of 1880, Perry received a letter from the cattle outfit in New Mexico, the same one he had been heading to when he turned around at the rise outside Redrock Crossing. They were expanding their operation and looking for a man with Perry's experience to manage the northern portion of their range, which was a real position with real wages and a house. He showed the letter to Della. She read it twice. "It's a good offer," she said. "It is," he said. "Are you going to take it?" He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere without you," he said. "So the question is whether you want to go to New Mexico." She thought about this seriously, which he had come to expect and appreciate. She did not give easy answers to real questions. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to build something," he said. "Something of our own, not someone else's. I've worked for other people's ranches and other people's purposes for long enough that I'd like to work for ours." He paused. "The New Mexico position would give us the income to save for land, and in New Mexico there's land to be had." "And what about Marcus?" she asked. "Marcus has 3 good hands and his son is back from Tucson and learning the operation," Perry said. "He doesn't need me the way he did 2 years ago." "All right," she said. "Then let's go to New Mexico." They had a farewell supper at the Donahue house that included Walt Odom and the cook from the Silver Bell, and a dozen other people from Redrock Crossing who had accumulated in their lives over the previous 2 years without their quite noticing. And Marcus gave a shorter toast that was no less genuine, and Bet cried openly, and in good conscience, and gave Della a quilt she had been making in secret for months, which was beautiful. Perry shook Marcus's hand on the porch in the morning when they rode out and found that handshake harder to complete than he had expected. "Come back when you have something to celebrate," Marcus said. "We will," Perry said. He would keep that promise. The drive to New Mexico territory was 5 days along the southern route, past the Red Rock country, and out into wider landscape that Perry had ridden through, but never stopped in rolling grassland and high desert, and the occasional town that was newer and rower than Redrock Crossing, and had not yet decided what it was going to be. James, who was 11 months old and who had apparently decided that a long ride was an excellent opportunity to observe as much as possible, spent most of the journey in Della's arms, or in the carrier that Perry had rigged across Solomon's pommel, studying the territory with the same clear eyes his mother used. The house that came with the position at the cattle outfit, the Rowan and Briggs operation, headquartered on a property about 40 miles north of Santa Fe, was a 2-room adobe that needed work but was solid, and had a good well and a southern exposure that made it warm in the mornings. Perry got to work on it immediately. He was, among other things, a competent builder, a skill he had acquired through years of necessity, and over the following months the house became 3 rooms, then 4, with a proper porch and shuttered windows and a small barn. Della found the horses in New Mexico different from the Arizona stock, bred differently, with more Spanish blood in them, finer boned and faster, but with a particular intelligence that she found challenging and fascinating. She set up a small supplementary operation on the property, nothing as elaborate as the Donahue spread, but enough to keep her hands in the work she loved and to bring in a small additional income. Perry's work for Rowan and Briggs was demanding, and sometimes took him away from home for stretches of several days or a week, which both of them found more difficult than either had expected. He had not previously been the kind of man who minded his own solitude, and discovering that he minded the absence of her and James with a genuine and specific ache was information about himself that surprised him, and that he relayed to her in letters that he wrote at night on the range, by fire, with more care than he had given to most things in his life. She wrote back every time, and her letters were long and honest and full of James's latest developments, and the horses and the news from the property and the ordinary beautiful details of a life being lived, and Perry read them by fire on the range and thought that he had been a man whose future felt like a vast and empty country, and now it felt like this specific, warm, full of real things. In the fall of 1881, Della was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, or at least she said it was, which Perry did not entirely believe because he had learned in the previous 2 years to distinguish between what Della said and what she felt, the gap being usually small but sometimes significant when she was protecting him from worry. He stayed close to home in the later months, negotiating with Rowan and Briggs a temporary reduction in his range duties, which they accepted on the grounds that Perry had earned considerable credit with them over the previous year and a half. The daughter was born in March of 1882, small and furious, with a pair of lungs that James found fascinating and a grip that Perry found impossible not to be completely undone by. "She's stronger than he was," Perry said, this small person attached to his finger with an authority that seemed disproportionate to her size. "She knows what she wants," Della said, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who recognized this quality and approved of it. They named her Clara, for Daniel's wife, which delighted Daniel and Clara in Missouri in a way that read clearly through the letter Daniel sent back 2 months later. James, at 2.5, was unsure about Clara for approximately 3 days, and then became her guardian with a protectiveness that Perry found simultaneously funny and deeply moving. He would stand beside her when she was in the basket near the porch and inform visitors that this was his sister, and that she was sleeping and they should be quiet, which was delivered with the gravity of a man twice his age and the execution of a person who still fell over when he walked too fast. By the spring of 1883, Perry had saved enough, in combination with what Della had earned from her horsework, to begin thinking about land. He had been looking for 2 years, not urgently but seriously, riding the range with the eye of a man who knows what he is looking for and is waiting for the right thing rather than the convenient thing. He found it in the late spring of that year, a parcel of 480 acres on the eastern slope of a long valley, about 15 miles from the nearest town, with a year-round stream and grass that had not been overgrazed, and a prospect to the west that included the kind of dramatic terrain that he had been telling himself was impractical to care about, and that he clearly cared about very much. He brought Della to see it on a clear morning in April. She rode beside him in silence as they came over the ridge and the valley opened below them, the stream glinting in the morning sun and the grass coming in green from the spring rains and the mountains to the west purple and white-capped above the middle distance. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "This is it." "Yes," he said. "How soon can we file?" "I've already spoken to the land office," he said. "If we want it, it's ours." She turned and looked at him, and in her face was something that had all the clear-eyed steadiness he had first noticed in the Silver Bell, and underneath it, now, after 5 years, a happiness that was not dramatic but was deep, the kind of happiness that has put down roots and does not need to perform itself because it simply is. "We want it," she said. They filed in May of 1883. Perry spent the summer building with the help of two men from the nearby town, a Mexican carpenter named Torres whose work was excellent, and a young man named Hodges who was learning and became excellent under Torres' direction. The house was the biggest project Perry had undertaken, 2 stories, 6 rooms, adobe on the lower level and wood frame on the upper, with a wide porch on the south and east sides and windows that Della had specified with care, so that the light fell into the rooms the way she wanted it to in the mornings and evenings. She oversaw the horse facilities with the same specificity. The barn large enough for 12 horses, the training yard fenced to exact dimensions, the small separate structure where feed and tack could be stored properly. Hodges, who had not previously encountered a woman who had engineering opinions about a horse barn, adjusted his understanding of the world accordingly, and within a month was asking her advice before making decisions, which Torres observed with evident amusement. They moved in October of 1883, when the house was not completely finished but was habitable, and Perry carried Della over the threshold not because she required it, but because she laughed when he did it, and he had come to understand that her full laugh was one of the things he was building everything around. James, who was 4 by this time, ran through every room of the house with the energy of someone performing an inspection, reported back that the upstairs room with the east window was his, and was told that it was, and was satisfied. The Barker Ranch, which they named simply the Kingsley Barker, because Della's name was in it and always would be, took shape over the following years. Perry maintained his connection with Rowan and Briggs as a consulting arrangement, riding for them perhaps 2 months of the year, which kept income coming in during the years when the ranch was not yet fully profitable. Della's horse operation grew steadily, her reputation for producing well-trained, sound horses spreading through the territory in the way that good reputations spread, not through advertising but through the horses themselves, which went out into the territory and did the work they were supposed to do and came home reliable and level, and people noticed. In 1884, Daniel and Clara came from Missouri for a visit, a journey of impressive ambition with their 2 boys in tow, and the 2 families filled the Kingsley Barker house for 2 weeks with noise and food and the particular warmth of people who have recently discovered each other. Daniel and Perry sat on the porch one evening while the women were inside with the children, and Perry looked at his brother, older, different, shaped by his own years in ways Perry had not witnessed, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since he left Missouri at 16. "I should have written more," Perry said. "You wrote when you had something to say," Daniel said. "That's more honest than writing for its own sake." It still wasn't enough. Daniel looked at him and then at the valley, the evening light on the mountains. "You're different," Daniel said, "from what I expected, from how I remembered you. Is that good or bad?" "Good," Daniel said without hesitation. "You used to have the look of a man who was expecting a blow from an unknown direction. You don't have that anymore." Perry thought about this. "No," he said, "I don't." "That's her doing," Daniel said. "And mine," Perry said. "And yours," Daniel agreed. "But mostly hers." Perry did not argue. Clara and Della had, by the end of the 2 weeks, established the kind of friendship that would sustain years of distance through letters and occasional visits, and the boys, Daniel's Robert and Henry, and James, had reached the permanent loud alliance that small boys form in the territory when they discover each other, which would be maintained by correspondence until they were grown, and by a standing agreement to meet once a year at whichever of the 2 properties had the most room. The territory changed in the 1880s in ways that were not always comfortable to witness. The railroads came further in, and with them more people, and with more people came more pressure on the land and on the people who had been there before. The Apache and Navajo and other nations who had lived in this country since before anyone now living could remember, and whose circumstances under the policies of the federal government were a source of ongoing injustice that Perry and Della were aware of even when they were powerless to address it directly. There was a family Apache, a man named Nate and his wife and 3 children, who had been displaced from their land and were in circumstances of considerable hardship in the spring of 1885, when Perry encountered them on the range during one of his consulting rides for Rowan and Briggs. He brought them back to the ranch, because he could, and because it was the right thing to do. Della received them without comment or hesitation, which was consistent with everything he knew about her, and which still, in its totality, moved him. Nate and his family stayed for several weeks while their situation was sorted out in negotiation with the local agency that was frustrating and incomplete in the way that all such negotiations were. But that resulted in Nate's family being permitted to settle on a small parcel of land adjacent to the agency territory. Perry and Della provided food and horses and did not make a ceremony of doing so. On the day Nate's family left, Nate said something to Perry in a mixture of Apache and accented English that Perry did not fully understand, but grasped the substance of something about a man knowing his own ground and the quality of that knowing. "He says you know where your feet are," Della said. She had picked up more than Perry had. "I do," Perry said. Nate looked at Della and said something direct and brief. "He says the woman is the reason," Della said, and her voice was even but her eyes were warm. "He's right," Perry said. Nate nodded as if this was confirmed and not a surprise, and they rode out. And Perry watched them go and thought about what it meant to know where your feet were, and about all the years he had not known, and about the woman standing beside him who had been, in every meaningful sense, the fixed point he had found his bearing on. In 1886, the 3rd child was born, another boy, which James greeted with loud approval, and Clara greeted with the equanimity of a 2-year-old who was not sure what it meant but was willing to accept it. They named him Daniel Marcus, which honored both Perry's brother and the man who had given them both a place to land in the beginning, and Marcus Donahue, when the letter arrived at the old ranch in Arizona, was reportedly observed by Bet to sit down on the porch and be very quiet for a full 5 minutes. Bet wrote to Della. "He read the letter and then he sat out front and didn't say a word for the longest time I have ever known him to be quiet. Then he came inside and said, 'I'll be damned,' and then he went out to the training yard and spent an hour with the horses. He says thank you. We both say thank you." Perry and Della read this letter at the kitchen table in the evening, with James doing something loud in the backyard and Clara asleep already and Daniel Marcus in his basket by the fire, and Perry reached across the table and took Della's hand. "We should go back," he said, "to Red Rock Crossing. I told Marcus I'd come back when I had something to celebrate." "We have quite a lot to celebrate," Della said. "We have more than I ever expected," he said. She looked at him across the table in the firelight. This woman he had found in a saloon and followed to a ranch, and followed again to an arch over a canyon where a hat and a gust of wind had brought him to his knees. And she said, "So do I." They went back to Red Rock Crossing in the spring of 1887, the whole family, which was a considerable undertaking involving a wagon and 3 children and 5 horses. James being old enough to manage a horse of his own, and doing so with a combination of his father's precision and his mother's ease that was visible even at 9 years old. Red Rock Crossing had changed somewhat in the 9 years since Perry had first ridden through it. There were more buildings now, a proper bank, a second doctor who did not drink, a small school that had been built the previous year by community subscription. But the red rock formations above the valley were unchanged, and the Silver Bell Saloon was unchanged, and Marcus and Bet Donahue were essentially unchanged, if somewhat older and more thoroughly settled, with their son running the ranch and Marcus consulting magnificently from the porch. The reunion dinner at the Donahue house was large and loud and went late into the evening, and Marcus looked at the children, James solemn and attentive, Clara exploring every corner of the house with the thoroughness of someone who had been told all her life about this place. Baby Daniel Marcus passed from arm to arm, and appearing to consider all of it acceptable, and said something he had not said in many years about being satisfied with the world. "I will make an admission," Marcus said, when the supper things had been cleared and the children were sleeping in the back rooms, and the 4 adults were on the porch with coffee in the warm Arizona night. "When Perry first turned around and came back to the ranch after 3 days, I thought, good, because I had seen how he looked at her that first day in the breaking pen, and I knew it wasn't going anywhere until he admitted it." "You said nothing," Perry said. "A man who says something too early ruins it," Marcus said philosophically. "He told me," Bet said. "The same night. He came in for supper and he said Della's going to have Perry Barker sorted out within the month." Perry looked at Della. She looked back at him with the expression that was warm and direct and deep, and he thought, yes, she had sorted him out. Entirely and correctly and without cruelty, which was the difference between her and anyone he had known before. "Did you know," he asked her, "that first day in the breaking pen? I knew you had come back," she said. "That told me enough. I came back for my knife stone." "Perry," she said, and she was smiling. "It's a very good stone," Marcus said, completely deadpan, and even Bet laughed. They stayed in Ridge Rock Crossing for a week. Perry visited the arch on the second day, alone in the early morning, climbing the rock steps in the cool air as he had climbed them years ago. The arch was the same vast span of red rock, the same drop to the canyon, the same wind coming off the ridge in long, steady surges. He stood on it and looked north across the territory, the land he knew now in the way that you know a thing you have lived in not as scenery, but as texture and substance and specific memory, and thought about what it meant that he had been brought to his knees here not by weakness but by instinct, some deep animal knowledge moving faster than his careful mind. He had sworn he would never kneel for any woman. He had meant it at the time as a statement about self-preservation. What he had not understood at the time was that what he was protecting himself from was also what he was protecting himself against being broken open, against the unbearable risk of being known, against the specific vulnerability of choosing and being chosen back. He had gotten it exactly backward. The kneeling had not been diminishment. It had been the beginning of everything worth having. He came back down from the arch and found Della waiting at the bottom with James, who had wanted to see the famous view, and he brought them both up, holding James's hand on the narrow places, and they stood on the arch in the morning light, him and his wife and his son, the territory spread out below and the sky above and the red rocks enormous around them. James looked out at the country with Perry's gray eyes and Della's expressiveness and said, with absolute sincerity, "This is very big." "Yes," Perry said. "Are we going to stay here?" Perry looked at Della, who looked back at him with the clear brown gaze he had first seen in a saloon 9 years ago, which had never once in 9 years stopped being the thing his eyes went looking for in any room. "We live in New Mexico now," Perry said, "but we will always come back here." "Why?" James asked. Perry thought about how to say it, about a hat and a gust of wind and a man already on the ground before he knew he was moving, about a woman who had turned from a bar and walked toward the least threatening option in the room and become, in the space of months, the most important person in his life. "Because," he said, "this is where everything started." James accepted this with the seriousness of a child who trusts that adult reasons are real even when they are not fully explained, and he turned back to look at the view, and Della slipped her hand into Perry's, and the wind came off the ridge in a long, steady surge and lifted her hair, and her hat a different hat now, brown felt with a braided rawhide cord, almost identical to the one that had gone before tilted on her head. Perry's hand moved to catch it before the wind could take it. She caught his hand instead, hat and all, and held it. "I've got it," she said. "I know," he said. She looked up at him with everything she was, all the steadiness and the warmth and the directness and the years of it, the children and the horses and the ranch and the letters, and the 2 rooms that became 6 and the porch where they sat in the evenings watching the New Mexico light change on the mountains, all of it in her eyes at once, and none of it requiring a single word. He held her hand and held the hat and thought that this was what it meant to know where your feet were. Not certainty about everything, not the absence of difficulty, not the guarantee of smooth ground, but this: a fixed point, a clear gaze, a hand in yours that you had earned and that had earned you in return. He had sworn he would never kneel for any woman. He would spend the rest of his life grateful that he had been wrong. They went back to New Mexico in the spring. The long wagon rode home through familiar country, the children loud and alive beside them, and the Kingsley Barker ranch met them in the evening light with the smell of horses and fresh grass, and the particular quality of a place that knows it is home, because the people in it have decided it so. Perry unhitched the horses and Della carried Daniel Marcus inside, and James ran ahead to check on his horse, and Clara stood on the porch and looked at the mountains, which were going pink in the last of the sun, and said pretty, which was her primary aesthetic assessment at age 3 and remained entirely accurate. Perry came to stand beside Della in the doorway and looked at the valley and the mountains and the evening spreading itself out over the territory in slow, gorgeous indifference to anything small enough to be human. "Home," Della said. "Home," he agreed and meant it, and knew it all the way down. In the years that followed, the ranch grew and the family grew with it. A fourth child, a girl named Catherine for Della's mother, came in 1889, and Catherine Kingsley herself made the journey from Louisiana for the birth and stayed for 3 months, and was, in those months, more purely happy than she had been since before her husband died, which Della noticed and Perry noticed, and neither of them mentioned directly, because some things do not require mention to be real. James went away to school in Santa Fe at 14, which was 1893, and wrote home weekly with the diligence of a boy who had grown up understanding that words were how you stayed connected across distance, and who missed his family in a way he said plainly and without embarrassment, which Perry found in his son, a quality he himself had taken 40 years to develop and which he was quietly, immensely proud of. Clara developed her mother's gift with horses and her father's precision, a combination that proved formidable, and by the time she was 12, she was doing real work in the training yard and had opinions about horsemanship that tours, still around and still excellent, treated with the seriousness they deserved. Daniel Marcus grew up quieter than his siblings, more watchful, with Perry's gray eyes and a quality of attention that seemed, from early on, aimed at understanding how things worked: the ranch, the horses, the people, the territory. He spent long hours with Nate, who had by the mid-1890s established himself and his family on their parcel of land, and had become, in the loose and practical way of frontier communities, a neighbor and occasional collaborator. Daniel Marcus learned more Apache in those hours than anyone had expected, and could speak enough to be useful by the time he was 10, which Nate received with the particular satisfaction of a man who has passed something forward. Catherine, little Catherine, with her grandmother's name and her father's composure and her mother's laugh, came into her own in the new century, but that is a longer story and belongs to her, not here. Perry Barker, who had been a gunslinger and a scout and a ranch hand, and a man running from his own shadow, was 50 years old in 1900, lean still and gray-eyed still, with more gray in his hair and more lines from weather and years, and the specific excellent labor of a life fully lived. He was, in the way of men who have finally arrived at the place they were heading without knowing it, settled, not in the way of things that have stopped moving, but in the way of things that have found their center of gravity and move now from purpose rather than from flight. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the territory light change on the mountains, and Della sat beside him, and they talked about the day and the children and the horses and the things that needed doing and the things they had done. And sometimes they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when words are not the most efficient medium for what they mean. One evening in the fall of 1900, with the mountains orange in the last light and the smell of coming cold in the air, Della said, "Do you remember the Silver Bell?" "I remember the stew," Perry said. "It was very good stew. She laughed, full and genuine. It was adequate stew, she said. The best stew in the territory. You are sentimental about that stew. I met you because of that stew, he said. I will be sentimental about it for as long as I live. She reached over and took his hand as she had done 10,000 times, and the warmth of it was not less for being familiar. If anything, it was more compounded, rich with years. I walked into that saloon, she said, with no money and no destination and no idea what was coming next. I know, he said. And you told me about the Donahues. You needed the information. Perry, she said, and her voice was warm. All right, he said. I couldn't keep eating my stew. She squeezed his hand. The mountains went from orange to red to the deep blue of early evening, and the first stars came out above the valley, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses moved and settled. Thank you, she said. He looked at her. For what? For turning around, she said. At the rise, for coming back. He thought about the rise east of Redrock Crossing, the flat brown country ahead of him and the reason behind him, the moment when he had sat on Solomon and looked at New Mexico and turned around anyway and not been able to account for it in any practical terms. Thank you, he said, for dropping your hat. She looked at him with those eyes, still, after 22 years, the clearest and most honestly seeing eyes he had ever encountered, and smiled. I didn't drop it on purpose, she said. I know, he said. That's the best part. He brought her hand up and held it, and they sat in the evening with the territory going dark around them, unhurried and complete, two people who had found each other against ordinary probability, and had built from that finding something real and lasting and full of the specific ordinary beauty of a life that has been genuinely chosen, all the way through. The gunslinger had sworn he would never kneel for any woman. On an arch over a canyon in Arizona, with the wind taking her hat and his body moving before his mind could stop it, he had found out exactly what that oath was worth, and had spent every year since then discovering, in all the ways that mattered, exactly how right it had been to be wrong.